Okay. What I'd like to start off by saying is really, first of all, that An-Nisa Society this year celebrates 30 years since we first set up, alhamdulillah, and it's been a big struggle as an independent women's organisation to A, to be taken seriously, B, to get our ideas and views credited, but despite all of that, alhamdulillah, I think the work women do often gets it's not acknowledged or appreciated, but still rewarded with Allah, and we're still here after 50 years, alhamdulillah. And what I would like to start off by saying is that a few years back, I was at a conference in Fez, and I had the opportunity to speak to a very prominent scholar there, and he said to me, "Oh, Humera, we've got to do something about the problem of Muslim women." So very respectfully, I said, okay. Because I personally don't really like to talk very much about the problems of Muslim women, because I've done it, I've been there and worn the t-shirt, but I think that the future, from experience I can say, is that the issues that women face is not a women's issue. The issues women face is a social issue, and the solutions is not going to be found in women-centric only solutions. The solutions will be found in men and women working together to eliminate discrimination or whatever sort of injustices exist in society. And if we leave the women alone to deal with it, I think we create new problems. So therefore, I'm personally not very much for segregated solutions. I think they have to be done together because we are a community, we're a society. So this is what I said to him. I said that, I told him this, and I said I'm not very keen to do that. And so therefore, nothing happened, basically. And I think what I'd like to say to women is you have a choice, right? I think today is very different from 30 years ago, when we were really struggling to understand at a very basic level what the Quran said about women. And I think that that battle has been won overall, that we, even at a very basic level, we feel at peace in our relationship with God, and our relationship with the Quran, even though we may not always find that reflected in society. But I think, generally speaking, we are, alhamdulillah, we're okay with that. So therefore, we have a choice. We have a choice: do we stay victims? Do we stay pathetically waiting for somebody to come and save us? Do we wait, thinking that the solution is somewhere else? Or do we get engaged ourselves? Do we take the mantle? Do we get involved? Do we, you have a choice. You can either be, inshallah, many of you are very happy and successful in your lives, but those of you who don't feel like that, you're either going to be sitting festering, feeling a victim, or you're going to be struggling for change. And you have to decide which struggle you want, because it's one or the other. Okay, there you are. This is just an artist's impression. It might not have looked exactly like that. But what you will notice is that people are very close by, even in pre-Islamic Arabia. They're not living like miles away in high-rise apartments or something like that. Very close. So when we read about the Sunnah, we read about the history, we have to imagine that people who live very connected to each other. So just stay there for a minute and imagine in this place there's a young man, orphaned, and very aware because of his upbringing, his experiences of being on the fringes of society, of how people suffer. He had an experience of that, right? So he's there. He was aware of the inequalities in that society. And he came and he, even before Revelation, he got involved with a group of people who were Hilful Fulu, which was about, working for justice in society. Okay, so he already did that. And then after Revelation, Makkah, something changing. So we see, from the side point of view, things don't stay the same. They grow and they develop. And the thing about Makkah is, I think, that I'd like to say is that Makkah, at the time before Revelation, had lost its spiritual compass. We know the origin of it, but it lost its spiritual compass. And one of the signs of its society was sexual exploitation and economic exploitation. So these were things that were happening in society, and therefore the task of the Prophet ﷺ in Makkah was to realign the spiritual compass. And so the work he did in those early years was about reminding people of the Creator, reminding people of their responsibility towards Him, and vice versa, which was hard. Imagine being today, I mean it's very similar today, many of us in our communities and societies, we've lost our spiritual compass. We don't really know the origins of many aspects of our religion. And how do we're struggling to re-find our spiritual center, right? So this was similar at that time. And then Makkah grew into a sort of bigger city, as you can see. And this is just an artist's impression of what the Prophet's house might look like, right? Simple, straightforward. It didn't have chandeliers. It didn't have, gold-rimmed ceilings or anything like that. Simple, straightforward. He was a simple man. And this is an artist's impression of the mosque in Medina, right? Again, straightforward. And if you look how it might have been, and if we say that Makkah represents the spiritual compass getting back into alignment, the Meccan, Medinan period was about the society as a whole. They're not mutually exclusive, but generally speaking, that's how we tend to talk about them. And in Medina, if you imagine those small houses were where the wives of the Prophet lived, that was the mosque. And when we read the hadith about the Prophet doing zakah or going to the mosque, and there's that several incidences of that man who came and urinated in the mosque, and how the Prophet responded to him. That's where he was, that's what he would have been doing. And it was part and parcel of society, people living close by, so that the concept of community was that people were living and responsible to each other, right? Within that context, in Medina in particular, we get the reinforcement, really, of social change for Muslim women, right? The Prophet was living in a patriarchal society, right? And through the Quran and his Sunnah, he led this patriarchal society to a society which I would like to call consensual. And by consensual, I meant that there was mutual respect, mutual negotiation, mutual appreciation, value of very core things in Islam, like family, community, respect and all that kind of stuff. So these were the things that were reinforced in Medina. And you've got to imagine how he might have done it. And in Medina, he wasn't just Muslims living there, there were Jews and Christians and other sort of religions and other people, and he had to manage all of that. So the situation we find ourselves in today is not new, with people who come from different traditions. So this is something from our tradition. Again, just to show you the proximity of how people lived. And I think once you really get to grips with the proximity and the closeness of that people lived in their everyday life. I asked a question once to my teacher, and I said, asking about childbirth and the time I was having children, I said, did the Prophet ever witness the birth of his child, his children? He said he didn't know, because there's no particular reference to it. But he said if you look at the way the houses were, and they were usually just 2 rooms or something, he said he can't imagine that he was far, right? And it would have been normal in such a close proximity that you would have heard the crying of a newborn child all over the place. And you would have heard it. And then when you hear the stories of when Sayyidina Umar was arguing with his daughter or wife about the Prophet, and it was overheard, the conversation was overheard, they would have been just passing like that, so it's close, right? So in Medina, what we find is that the conditions of Mecca, which was sexual exploitation, economic exploitation, slavery, etc., the Prophet ﷺ changed that. And the role of women within that, mutually inclusive, was established. Okay, and this is just moving on. I just want to give you an idea in Damascus, how things didn't really change. We're talking about 100 years or so after that. The principles in early Islamic communities was the same. That you had, and in this one you find there's a church as well as a mosque. So therefore people of different faiths lived side by side with each other. It wasn't difficult. And so building up a case for change, right? Let's go back to Medina, right? Because that's where I want to focus and keep it on. All right, so imagine you're in this environment, and how did things change? How did the Prophet change that? He was challenging. He didn't come and everybody said, yes, we agree with you. No, he was challenging. He challenged the things in society. We're very scared today to challenge things, but he challenged. He reconnected. He didn't just challenge and leave it and say, what are you doing that's wrong? without making reconnection. For whatever he might have questioned and challenged, he gave her something else in its place. He reconnected people. And he empowered. With his wisdom, when we follow the different things that he did, we see that he was empowering of people. And I was talking to some mums recently, and we were talking about shouting at children and telling them off and saying, we had a sheikh come to our school that we run on Father's Day to talk about fatherhood, and he gave an example of the Prophet of how he was with children and how he would get children to do things without ever raising his voice. And I said, oh, I don't think I could ever really do that myself. I can't imagine that. So I'm trying to challenge myself to say, how do you work with children without getting angry, without losing your temper, without, because that's the sunnah after all. And he integrated. So you had processes of change. So therefore, once, you see something that's not quite right, you offer solutions, and then the new way of thinking gets integrated into your everyday life. So therefore, today, if we make it in relation to today, we find ourselves, if we put children in the centre of change, because our younger generation are in that change. And myself, I am second generation. I've lived in Britain all my life, and I personally feel like I'm in the middle of these two pressures, basically. One which is from our families and our communities, that are traditional communities, and the new societies that we're moving into. And when we're pulled in two directions, and it seems very superficially, at least, that these are pulling us in different directions. Maybe because of fear and anxiety, loss of our traditions, we are sort of fossilizing what we remember of the past and reinforcing our cultures which are no longer relevant to us any longer. And we're afraid to try something new. But just remember, that is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ did. That society in Mecca was hardened in its tradition. More hardened than today, possibly, right? And he imagined what he had to do in order to shift. And I often give the analogy that the challenge is for us as Muslims, it's like when when you have a heavy rock in the same place for a long time, and then you lift it, and you get all those maggots, right? That's where we're at today. The rock has been lifted, and we've got to deal with our maggots, all right? Okay. And so where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves having been guided away from patriarchy, right, which is a male-centric dominated society. We're back in patriarchy overall, where women are generally excluded or seen to be part of the private world, where women are no longer part of the public world, where in fact, as we know, that women were actively brought into the public arena in Islamic cultures, civilization. And gender segregation. I do believe in gender segregation in a context, particularly a spiritual context, but I think for society as a whole to be segregated to the extent that we are, I personally think it's dangerous because we no longer talk to each other, we don't know each other, we don't, I've just been to a wedding in a Muslim country, and the men and women never meet. There's no social functions that they gather. The families don't do anything together. And the women are all miserable, and the men are going off having second wives and going off and getting on with whatever. And so therefore the very nature of the segregation is creating the problems that we're all trying to resolve. So for me, I think Islam, when we have our centered in our relationship to our God and ourselves, we don't sit around simpering and thinking the only thing that's important in life is to find a man, right? Because we have a purpose, all right? So our role as women, as men, is to find a purpose. Sorry, if you go back a bit. I'm not against arranged marriages either. And I think I can say it's changed in 30 years. More and more people are marrying of their choices, but part of the issues with making your own choices different from the traditional way is that it creates new challenges because people don't know each other. And people are no longer part of the secure structures that they grew up with. Therefore, the responsibility in the new ways people are getting married, which I think is great, like intermarriage, converts, born Muslim, and this, that, and the other, whole range of types of marriages that exist in the Muslim community. With these new experiences, we have to sort of respond to them with new approaches to them as well. And we're still very family-centered. I'm very happy about that. That Muslim culture still, despite everything, is family-centric. That we believe that the family is important. And what holds us back? Sometimes when we want to be honest about our issues, we want to talk about things, we're afraid about people attacking Islam, we're afraid of letting go of things that we think are part of Islam. We're scared of taking new ideas, we're scared of the misunderstanding of mainstream Islam society and also the misinterpretation of Islam. I just want to look a little bit on that, because one of the things that particularly holds women back is often the way theology is used. And the very famous one that I've heard since I can possibly ever remember is that if it had been permissible that a person prostrates before somebody else, it would be a wife towards a husband, right? And the operative word is if. In the same way in polygamy is if. The operative word is always if. If other conditions, although this is a little bit more controversial maybe, but that's the condition. And also if a woman dies while the husband is pleased with her, she will enter paradise. The question is, why should a husband's happiness be dependent on a woman getting to paradise? It's good, alhamdulillah, it should be good, but it should be mutual, right? But the Prophet said the most perfect believer in the matter of faith is one who has excellent behaviour, and the best amongst you are those who behave best towards their wives. So it's a bit of a contradiction often to what people say and reinforce often. And this is one about don't say off to your parents, basically, in terms of honour, right? And of course, that's in the Quran. It's in the Quran, so I'm nothing against it. But, right, this has been used, this verse, to really intimidate a lot of young people. And I know because I know these young people. And they are being treated badly by their parents, maybe. But one thing that they understand really well is, I can't say off to my parents. I can't go against my parents, even though the parents are being unjust. Right, for example, I know many situations where two people who are both Muslim and they want to get married to each other, parents disagree. Right, so what does that person do? Both of them are good Muslims, parents disagree, what do? They're being unjust. They should try every effort to reconcile their parents as much as possible, but if they don't, and it's all halal and all good, what should they do? How many of you, hands up, would say you'll get married anyway? Without parents' permission. Okay, not that many in relation to, well, so, okay, that's a real crisis for people. It's a real trauma for people when they have to make such a decision. So these are some of the contradictions in society which are changing but still exist. So what do Muslim women want? Muslim women want, it's easy. There are all sorts of different women. All the Muslim women in this room, you're all different from each other. There's no uniformity, right? So therefore we have to acknowledge all this difference. We're not a stereotype. Often in the way that Muslim women are presented in the public, even by conservative Muslims, is a stereotype that we're this certain kind of person. But we're different. We're feisty. We're spiritual. We're, sporty. We're a whole range of different things, and we have a right from an Islamic point of view to be those range of things within the context of Islam, right? And not to be led by other people's agendas. And one of the things that we've always tried to do with An-Nisa is not to be led by other people's agendas, just to, within our consciousness, from what we've understood about Islam, or what is possible for us to do, to keep that going. And as women, we have to decide, we've got a task ahead of us, and we haven't got time to waste. We have to work on our own personal spiritual journey at the same time as looking at the challenges in society. We heard earlier about nutrition. It's a big issue, but nutrition is not a women's issue. It's a social issue. It's for men and women. Let's not pigeonhole women to be doing all this. It's for both of us as men and women to be aware of these things. And then we have a massive task to address society. And I think women have a massive role to play, drawing from our instinct, drawing from our experience, things that we understand best, to contribute towards making the world a better place. Thank you very much.